Memories with the Future. Sonic had just pulled a popsicle out of the freezer, the current heat wave doing nothing to relieve the humidity that was rolling through the town outside. Tom had kicked the air conditioner on before he'd left for work, mumbling about how summer was definitely one of the worst seasons, especially if it happened to be a heat wave. And Sonic definitely didn't envy his father at all when he left for work. He couldn't imagine being stuck out in that weather. He rounded the corner, popsicle in his mouth, when he saw Maddie sitting on the floor in front of the coffee table, a large binder in front of her. She seemed to be flipping through the pages, and he felt himself tugged in her direction. Whitely sitting next to her on his knees as he just barely leaned over the edge of the table to look at the binder with her, pulling the popsicle out of his mouth when he realized it was a photo album.
Are you going through pictures?
He asked softly, eyes flicking over each photo in the clear slots of the pages. He'd never really seen their pictures before, besides the ones they had framed and hung on the wall for all to see, and he thought they looked pretty happy in those, but those were nothing compared to the ones in the album. He smiled softly when he saw them as teenagers, Tom with unruly hair forming a mullet, and that alone almost had Sonic in a fit of giggles. He looked ridiculous, nothing like the Tom he knew now, and he truly did have to wonder who let him do that with his hair.
That I am. Going to Rachel's wedding tomorrow made me want to look through here.
Maddie giggled when she noticed his eyes on Tom's younger photos.
Oh, I remember that haircut. He thought it was the coolest thing in the world, and I guess it kind of was back then.
He looks ridiculous.
Sonic snorted a laugh before she flipped the page, and he saw Tom and Maddie's senior prom photos. Her hair was a lot more wild back then, but she looked pretty nonetheless.
You look pretty.
Thanks, Blueberry.
She leaned over, pressing a kiss to his head.
That was our senior prom. You can see how stiff Tom looks.
She smiled before quickly flipping the page and pointing out a photo that was from the same day, probably a few minutes apart from the one he'd just seen. In that one, he and Maddie had their heads thrown back in laughter as Tom seemed to be trying to pick her up.
But it was just because my mom wanted a professional photo. I personally like this one a lot more.
Sonic smiled softly as he gazed at it, nodding his head. He had to agree. The only good photos are the ones that aren't forced. At least, that's what he's heard Tom say, but he did think it was far off the mark. Tom and Maddie seemed happier in that photo compared to the one Maddie's mother had wanted, and he thought it was nice seeing them smile like that. They still smile like that.
Back then we never thought we'd end up here.
Maddie commented softly with a smile.
We always knew we'd be together, we just didn't know who we'd be in the future.
She turned her head to look down at Sonic, watching him finish off his popsicle happily.
I think we got pretty lucky, though.
I can see why Green Hills is great, and he's the big sheriff, and you're the vet everyone trusts. What's not great about that?
He did catch the sentiment in her words there, not realizing she'd actually been talking about him, but he usually missed things like that, the little familial things, and it wasn't because he didn't love them, he just wasn't used to it.
I was talking about you, Mr. Speed.
She corrected, wrapping her arm around his shoulder so she could easily pull him close, squeezing him in her hold.
Oh!
Sonic bashfully looked down at his gloved hands, an occasional occurrence that only happened when their love for him was pointed out like a humongous neon sign with flickering letters. He couldn't help it, flushing red from the sudden attention and the shyness that came with it. It was too much to process sometimes.
Oh.
Maddie seemed to playfully mock him, though, both hands suddenly smoothing over his ears to pull out a soft laugh, grinning when she had heard the boy's laughter.
But he, look at these.
Her hand drifted from his ear, going down to flip a page of the album again. Sonic's eyes widened when he saw the pictures, pulling away from Maddie's hands to perch over her thigh and examine them closely. Their wedding photos were covering the page. Maddie walking down the aisle, the ring ceremony, Tom and Maddie crying during their vows, and their shared kiss. They were all printed out in pristine condition. Their wedding had been outside, close to the town lake with a gazebo that had been decorated in flowers, purple and pink petals on the easel. It was so vivid in his memory because he had been there.
I remember this.
He grinned as he reached forward to flick through more of the wedding photos.
I was there.
He swiveled his head to look at Maddie, hoping she'd share his excitement, but there was only concern written over her face, and that had quickly tugged his grin down.
Maddie!
You were there.
She asked softly, tenderly cupping his jaw in her hands as she looked down at him, and he could feel himself shrinking under her gaze. Why was she so worried? He had wanted her to be worried when he told her.
Babby, you were 13.
Sonic nodded his head as his eyebrows furrowed together confusedly. He couldn't grasp why his age now was so crucial to her that it melted her earlier smile and positive energy. He frowned as his gaze flickered over her face, noting the slight tremble in her lip as she continued to brush her thumbs back and forth over his cheeks, and he felt responsible for her mood change. Maybe he shouldn't have said anything. She'd been so happy before he.
Yes.
He punched the words out of throat, his voice soft and meek as his question hung in the air. It wasn't a direct question, but a subtle hint to why does that matter? I'm sorry I made you upset, and he hoped she wouldn't sense the unsaid apology in the air.
Blueberry, we got married in 2012 in July.
His eyebrows stayed furrowed as his face rested in her palms, and he knew she was finally picking up on why he was confused.
You, Sonic, you would have been 5.
That's why she was upset. He was a toddler barely reaching kid status, and he was a toddler watching their wedding from the woods while being alone, and he saw it in her eyes now as he searched her gaze. Pity. His breath hitched and he reluctantly pulled his face out of her palms, shifting away from her as his eyes trained themselves on the tan carpet beneath his knees, taking good heavy breaths. The last thing he ever wanted to see was pity, for someone to look at him like they were regretful or thought he was misfortunate, and he definitely never wanted to see it from Maddie.
So what?
He asked defensively, his posture straightening as his tone edged with pity for himself, but he tried to hide it with a weak chuckle.
I just watched from the forest. I watched you walk down the aisle throwing flowers. I heard your vows, and I watched you guys smile, hand kiss, and I watched everyone cheer. And I was totally fine watching from the woods. It was actually really awesome because I was.
His face was in Maddie's palms again, eased in tenderly as to not startle him. And, whoa, when had he scrunched his face up like he was in pain? And when did his eyes start to burn? And when had he clenched his fists? When it's
Babby.
It was just one word, and it was one word that should mean very little to him, but it had his shoulders rolling back in defeat as he bit his tongue to will down the tears blurring his vision, and he wasn't sure when he'd squeezed his eyes shut and let Maddie pull him close to her chest, muzzle resting in the crook of her neck.
I am not pitying you, baby. I am sympathizing with you, and I am so sorry you were alone for so long.
Maddie pressed his wheels back on his head, for along with it as she pressed a kiss to his head, cradling her son against her as he cried, shifting him into her lap easily. His legs didn't need much prompting when it came to removing him, and he was so going to be hard on himself later because who just cries like this, like they're a baby?
I am so proud of you for surviving out there, okay? For taking care of yourself when you had no one. And I'm so proud of you for growing into our family because I know it was hard to make that shift and adjustment. And I am so happy you were with us now, okay? I love you, baby. You are not alone anymore.
Okay, never mind. He couldn't possibly be hard on himself when she made his littlest achievements seem like they were such a big deal, all the way from growing up, moving into their attic, accepting their guidance. She made it seem so important that every little step was something to be proud of, and he wanted to despise her for that, but he couldn't. He loved her for it. Actually, it made him feel less frustrated with himself, always doubling down on his own insecurities like they were something to be ashamed of. But Maddie would never let him do that for long.
I got you.
She whispered against his head, and he couldn't help the way his fingers clung to her shirt after it'd been said, because it's what he'd always wanted to hear, that someone has him and he's not going anywhere, and he was so glad it was Maddie that had him. They'd sat like that for a while, apparently, because eventually Tom had come walking into the house after work, complaining about the raccoons that still wouldn't seem to scatter, and the two had simply stared up at him with their glossy eyes and sorrowful faces, realizing that it was dark out when they both remembered the sun being there 5 minutes ago.
What did I miss?
He'd ask, trying to lighten up the mood by joking and grinning, but the sight concerned him too much to actually land the joke, or the grin for that matter, but Sonic seemed to like it because he'd managed a weak smile as Tom hung his duty belt up on a hanger. He didn't bother changing from his sheriff uniform, quickly finding himself beside Maddie on the floor as they shared a gaze.
You okay, bud? Yeah, I just... Ah.
Sonic cleared his throat, whipping his eyes as he felt Tom set a hand gently on the side of his head.
I was alone for a really long time, huh?
Tom inhaled sharply as he realized that this was the conversation they were finally having, but he sighed as he got comfortable.
Yeah, fortunately you were, but he's horribly alone, honestly.
He shared another gaze with his wife before focusing on their kid.
And we wished we'd known about you before, but we didn't. But they're happy we have now. Remember that we're just working on stuff to make up for all the time on.
Communication and affection and school.
Maddie commented quickly.
And listening.
She finally teased and managed a giggle out of his mouth as she squeezed him lightly.
Yeah.
He mumbled softly after, leaning into their arms for the time being. He always found himself most comfortable there. Not that he'd ever be able to say it out loud like that, but he did. Then,
Thank you. Anything for you anytime, any weekend.
Tom mumbled softly, pressing his hand against his head gently as if it were a hug.
He told me he watched our wedding, that he was there.
Maddie relayed to Tom later after they tucked their son into bed.
5 years old, watching from the woods.
How about my photo album was on the table with our wedding photos on display?
Tom had responded with a tease to his tone, but he'd eased up rather quickly.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. We knew that he was on before, that he'd been watching us for years. I'm not really surprised he was there.
Tell him he was all alone. He was a baby. I can't believe there was no one there to take care of him or keep him safe. It just...
She sighed as she rested her back against their bed's headward.
It just sucks.
He finished for her.
I will forever say I wish we'd found him sooner.
Maddie chewed on her bottom lip as she thought, eyebrows furrowing before turning to gaze at her husband.
We should do a vow renewal. Renew the rings, renew the vows, renew the photos.
She said suddenly.
A second wedding is basically what you're suggesting to me right now at 2 in the morning.
So he can be there.
She stressed, grabbing his arm with her hands.
I want him to be there with us, standing next to us. Come on, Tom. You can be your little best man, and I'll get Jojo, Randall, and Rachel to come up, your mom, my parents. Wait, we can do it a couple weeks after Rachel's wedding. It wouldn't take very long.
Tom pursed his lips together before smiling softly and shaking his head.
But how can I say no to the deal of having a little best man?
And Maddie had smiled so big then, when he'd agreed to have a vow renewal, that he'd smiled, too. He'd always thought their wedding photos were missing something, and maybe Sonic just happened to be that something. Unfortunately, the planning had been cut short for that vow renewal. Robotnik swooped in to ruin things, but they shouldn't have been surprised, especially not when their kid had come crashing through a portal with a fox, hurt and panicking, then tased and locked in a cage, and then almost crushed by a gigantic robot foot. There simply just had been any time in that mess, or after that mess, to continue talking about it. Raising 2 more kids and getting them used to the world takes up a lot of time, apparently, enough time that it'd been months before the topic was brought up again. Sonic had come wandering down the stairs, ready to find something to snack on, but instead he was met with Maddie smoothing out her wedding dress that she was actually wearing at the bottom of the stairs while Rachel fiddled with her hair. He'd known about Rachel, Jojo, and Randall coming to town for a visit, but he had no clue what this was or why it was happening.
Mom.
He furrowed his eyebrows as he quickly hopped down the steps, eager to get to her before Rachel was able to finish her hair. Oh gosh, is she leaving Tom? Did Rachel finally convince her to leave?
Mom, are you leaving Dad?
He asked, grasping for her hands desperately.
Yep.
Sonic swore that his heart stopped beating.
For Zac Efron.
And there it was. A relieved breath forced itself out of his lungs, easily catching the joke, and Maddie seemed relieved that he'd caught onto it, too.
No, but we are doing a vow renewal ceremony.
What? When?
He switched his gaze up to Rachel. Rachel clicked her tongue and looked at her sister through the mirror.
Did your husband not?
She began to chide before putting her gaze on Sonic.
Did not tell you.
Tell me what?
He shouldn't be worried. He really shouldn't be. But every second that passed where everything wasn't being explained to him had him on the tips of his toes in panic. Someone needed to tell him what was going on, or he might just speed himself into a spiral.
Thomas Michael Wachowski, get in here and talk to your son.
Rachel's voice boomed through the house. Tom quickly dashed out from his and Maddie's room.
Buddy, hey.
He was quick to kneel down in front of his son, already clad in a pristine black suit, as his steady hands eagerly rested on both of his shoulders, branding Sonic without him realizing it. Or maybe Tom did realize it, and maybe that's why he did it.
Dad! What's going on?
He asked again, knowing if he were to get an answer from anyone, it'd be Tom.
We do about real ceremony in the yard in 30 minutes.
Tom squeezed his shoulders when his eyes blew wide in shock, and quite possibly panic.
And you're telling me now?
Sonic hissed as he tried to pull out of Tom's grip, ready to run a mile and back as many times as it took to calm down. Why were they telling him now? Why didn't they tell him before? Did they forget about him? Had they forgotten he was there? Did they not want him to know?
Sonic, give me.
Tom's hands were on the sides of his face, holding his jaw to focus his gaze on him and him alone.
I want you to be my best man. I was gonna surprise you. Thank you for nothing, Rachel. You freaked my cat.
You should have told him before, Thomas. That is not on me.
Best man, Tom wanted him, Sonic Wachowski, to be his best man at his parents' vow renewal ceremony. His breath hitched as his gaze flickered over his dad's face. Then
But what about weed? Or...
Nope, none of that. Want to be what you say, but want to be my little best man.
Tom looked so hopeful then. His full undivided attention was suddenly on Sonic, and he had to say that he missed that, because now he had to share it with two brothers who were just as needy as he was, and he also felt like he could cry, so he quickly cleared his throat.
I say, let's have a vow renewal ceremony.
He grinned bright and wide, so happy that his heart felt like it could burst and he'd somehow still find a way to live. He chuckled when Tom lifted him up and carried him to the kitchen, setting him on the table.
You don't put this on. Knuckles and Tails are laying there. I'm sorry I waited so long. Rachel's right. I should have asked you before this.
Tom held a small suit that matched his in his hands, taking it off the hangers and beginning to help his son put it on so there were no problems.
Dad, it's fine. I get it.
Sonic held his arms out as he slipped the suit jacket on his shoulders after having the white button-down collar flicked up by his dad.
You are stressed out, and your attention can be everywhere.
That sentence seemed to grip Tom's attention, though, letting go of the tie he'd just begun to wrap in favor of holding his son's face.
My attention should have been on you first, Sonic. You should always come first, and you from here on out. I can promise that.
He stated, not really expecting a response as his hands left his son's face to go back to tying the tie, situating it up on the shirt before flicking the collar down over it.
You know, I can't even be doing this ceremony without you.
Sonic tilted his head as he finished buttoning the suit jacket, opening his mouth to ask him what he meant. What did he mean by "we wouldn't be doing this without you"? But Rachel's voice cut through the air.
We're out of time. Let's go, out the door. This feels like you're waiting all over again.
She sighed. He decided to let it be so he wouldn't stress his aunt out on time, mentally reminding himself to ask later. He'd sped out the door after that, unfortunately after being told he had to wear the suit pants as well, but at least he had been the only one. Tails and Knuckles had been stuck in mostly white suits to match Maddie, and he couldn't help but feel a little special to be the only one matching Tom. He grinned as JoJo teased Tails with the rings, hiding one before magically pulling it out from behind his ear, making the kid sigh with relief, and he watched Knuckles stand with a bowette, looking slightly out of place. Apparently, he'd been given the role of man of honor, and he was taking it quite seriously. He lined up beside his father quickly at the makeshift podium, watching as everyone began to sit down, seeming to get the hint that the renewal was about to start.
Dad!
He couldn't help but ask in a whisper, having been close enough to converse.
Hey, son.
What did you mean when you said you wouldn't be doing this without me?
Sonic, you'd filed this away for later, not in the middle of the ceremony. Why'd he have to go and open his mouth?
We wanted you to be our wedding.
He mumbled softly as music began to play.
We wanted your wedding folks, Dad. You know, now we're doing all this for you, kid, because we want you in every aspect of our lives.
Sonic had not been expecting him to say that, and he couldn't respond now because Maddie was walking down the aisle with Tails, and JoJo holding both the rings, and a flower basket in front of her, and Knuckles trailing behind her storkily. But did he want to burst into tears? He bit his lip, straightening his posture in an attempt to look like he wasn't on the verge of tears. It wasn't as good as he'd hoped because Tails was suddenly beside him, holding his hand tightly and looking at him with worry and concern. And oh, did he love his brother.
Sonic, are you okay?
Tails whispered just loud enough for him to hear, and he quickly nodded his head in response, even as the tears started to slip down his muzzle, but he wouldn't cry right now. He'd watch as Maddie and Tom renewed their vows and traded their rings, kissing each other with big smiles, and he'd wait until everyone was cheering loudly to let out a sharp, "You-ite" sob, and he'd let Tails hold his hand tightly through it all.
Oh, baby.
Maddie's voice sifted through his ears like a song, and that's when Tails finally released his hand, being scooped up into her arms and held tightly. She swayed them back and forth.
What's wrong, Blueberry?
She smiled softly as she kissed the side of his head, and for some God-unknown reason, that only ripped out a sharper sob. Sonic sniffled as he choked on his words, tears continuously blurring his vision.
I love you guys so much, and I...
His voice crackled off into a sob, and she pressed his head to her shoulder, shushing him lovingly before he could finish.
Blueberry, we love you too.
She giggled, voice heavy with her own tears, but they weren't nearly as bad as Sonic's.
We have to take pictures, baby. Are you okay to do that?
She leaned back then, cupping his face and whipping away his tears with one hand. He'd managed to nod as they all gathered close to each other.
Why is my son so blue?
Tom cracked the joke just as easily as all his other dead jokes, having a full arsenal at all times. It was so majorly not annoying.
That's terrible, Dad.
He protested as he sniffled, heaving a few breaths before laughing wetly as more tears started to blur his vision.
Oh gosh, my jokes made him cry, man. Are we getting this?
He looked between her and the photographer with a blindingly bright smile before wrapping his arms around both his wife and his kid, tightly, reassuring that they weren't going anywhere. Sonic had tried to smile, really he did, through every photo, even the ones with the whole family, but he'd wound up in tears before any were actually taken. But of course, the photos were taken regardless if he was sobbing or not, and he felt so bad that he ruined their wedding photos with his incessant crying, but they both just brushed his apology aside.
We wouldn't have it any other way, kid. Besides, you will see that we're crying in them too.
Tom had told him before, holding him close, his tears finally having dried up, leaving his eyes red and glossy. But he was uncharacteristically okay with looking like a train wreck, especially if it got him all the cuddles he could ever dream of. Not that he was exploiting his feelings. No way at all. Somehow, he'd wound up in a small game of soccer with Randall, Tom, Jojo, Tails, and Knuckles once his vision was clear enough and his thoughts weren't constantly interrupted by the urge to cry. The game had ended pretty evenly, even after being human versus Mobian, but Sonic knew it was because Jojo was a pro at soccer, and that was the only reason they'd even come close to having a tie. After that, it gotten pretty late and everyone had deserted the Wachowski household, heading to their respective hotels for the night. Maddie had ended up carrying a very sleepy Tails inside, still trapped in her dress, but she didn't seem to mind in the slightest, and Knuckles had followed them inside silently. That left Tom and Sonic outside, tossing a baseball back and forth in their fancy suits to rid him of his extra energy. Usually, he'd be exhausted, especially after crying till his chest etched and knotted up, but he couldn't be more energized now.
Did you mean it?
Sonic asked suddenly, breaking the silence of the quiet game as he tossed the ball back. He watched Tom catch it and shift it between his hands before throwing it back for him to catch, then repeat.
Did I mean what?
That you did this so I could be there.
Tom held on to the ball after that, shaking the mitt off his hand and setting it on the ground with the ball. Leaving the He motioned for the blur to come into his vicinity, and he did so without hesitation.
Of course I meant it, Sonic.
He said as soon as he was kneeled down with a hand on his shoulder.
Maddie and I had been talking about it the night before Rachel's wedding, but a lot has happened since then.
He nodded. A lot had happened since then, a lot more than he was willing to talk about, because talking meant processing, and he really was not good at processing, so they'd left it alone for the time being. If he had a nightmare, he'd sleep in their bed, but he would never say much about it.
She was really adamant about having a ceremony for you. I was out on duty to be here for real, not stuck watching from the edge of the forest.
Sonic pursed his lips together, and his gaze found the grass beneath his feet more interesting than Tom.
You guys did so much for me already. You didn't have to.
He looked up and trailed his eyes over the yard, tables and chairs still laid out, along with fairy lights wrapped around a few of the trees.
Sonic.
Tom pushed Sonic's cheek, having him turn his head to focus back on him.
We'd do anything for you. Anywhere, anytime, whenever you wanted.
The blur smiled weakly before wrapping his arms around his shoulders.
You better not be asking to carry you inside and up to bed.
Sonic laughed tightly.
Please, Dad. Tails was carried.
He's at.
And I weigh less than Ozzy.
All right, fine. Come here, Blue Justice.
And instead of being gentle like Maddie was, Sonic's ankles were practically ripped out from underneath him, leaving him dangling upside down from Tom's shoulders. The boy groaned loudly and let his arms fall above his head, accepting his defeat.
You suck, Donut Lord.
I'll make sure with your head on the door frame.
If weeks later, the Wachowskis replaced their original wedding photos with the renewal ceremonies, no one mentioned it, but Sonic would cringe when he saw his blubbering self hung up on a wall. He'd smile warmly after, though, because Tom and Maddie had been crying with him, so maybe the photos really weren't all that bad after all, and he definitely didn't despise them. In fact, he actually loved them.